Good afternoon, Southminster scholars. It's only the end of October, but Thanksgiving and Christmas are approaching fast, and I want to give a shout out for a Southminster tradition, the Holiday Fund. We have nearly 400 hourly paid staff, but they are not just employees. They are like family. They are loyally faithful to us. Many have been with us 20 years, more. This past year, they've also been, in my thinking, superheroes, showing up here through COVID, regardless of their own personal worries, lives, needs, families. And our holiday fund is the opportunity to be there for them. I'd like to think one of the hallmarks of Southminster is loyalty up and loyalty down. And we want our appreciation to be meaningful, and hope you will contribute generously. And all contributions are tax deductible. The Scopes trial may be one of the best known to most Americans. The issue, creation versus evolution, and which would be taught in school. It was a hotly contested topic. You might say the old argument of religion versus science. You might say tradition versus reason. But the case was to be tried by two of the most well-known lawyers in America. William Jennings Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, the boy orator of the Platte, the famous Cross of Gold speech in 1896. Now, in 1924, age 68, he would be arguing in support of the Tennessee law banning any mention of evolution and requiring that only creation be taught. Arguing in support of teaching evolution would be Clarence Darrow, one of America's most prominent lawyers. We met him last week in the Leopold Low trial. Darrow himself was 68 years old, but still in full command of legal reasoning. The defendant was John Scopes, a 24-year-old science teacher who believed biology could not be honestly taught without teaching the concept of evolution. He agreed to become the lightning rod, challenging the Tennessee law prohibiting that. And so this was a showdown, if you will, a sort of shootout at the OK Corral in legal drama. The press descended on Dayton, Tennessee for the fireworks. In the lecture, watch for the background that led up to the trial. Why choose Dayton, Tennessee? Watch for how this would be the first ever trial broadcast live over radio. Watch for Judge John Ralston, a conservative Christian who craved the publicity that the trial would and did generate. Watch for Darrow's not caring who the jurors were or what they believed in anyway and why. Watch for the emotional opening statements. Bryan, if evolution wins, Christianity goes. Darrow, Scopes isn't on trial. Civilization is. Watch for the arguments over admissibility of evidence and the heated exchanges. And then watch for the most amazing court scene in history, where the defense called to the stand to testify as an expert on the Bible, the prosecutor himself, William Jennings Bryan. And then watch for the fireworks that followed.
The most imposing building in the town of Dayton, Tennessee, is the old Brick County Courthouse. A plaque stands in front of the courthouse and it reads, Here, from July 10 to 21, 1925, John Thomas Scopes, a county high school teacher, was tried for teaching that a man descended from a lower order of animals in violation of a lately passed state law. The monkey trial, as the Scopes trial is commonly called, took place in the second floor courtroom. The courtroom has been restored to look almost exactly as it did in 1925. Every July, local residents come to the courtroom to reenact key moments from the biggest event ever to occur in their town. The Scopes trial brought to Dayton a three-time presidential candidate, the most famous defense attorney in America, and a flock of national and international reporters. They came not because they cared whether John Scopes would pay a small fine or not. They came because of the question the trial raised. If there was ever a trial made for its time, the Scopes trial is it. The 1920s found social patterns in chaos. Traditionalists worried that everything valuable was ending. Younger modernists no longer asked whether society approved of their behavior. They danced to the sound of the jazz age, and they showed their contempt for alcoholic prohibition. Progressive ideas and intellectual experimentation also flourished, as Americans debated abstract art and Freudian theories. Meanwhile, in response to the new social patterns set in motion by modernism, a wave of religious revivalism developed, and nowhere was this wave stronger than in the South. Who would dominate American culture, the modernists or the traditionalists? Journalists were looking for a showdown, and they found one in Dayton, Tennessee. In the 1920s, populist William Jennings Bryan gave up running for president. Instead, he became the leader of a crusade to banish Darwin's theory of evolution from the classrooms. The anti-evolution campaign kept Bryan in the spotlight, a place he always longed to be. For him, the cause was really a perfect fit. He believed evolution contradicted the teachings of Genesis and undermined traditional values. He also cared deeply about equality. Bryan worried that Darwin's theories were being misused by supporters of a growing eugenics movement. Some in the movement advocated sterilizing, to use their phrase, inferior stock. By 1925, Bryan and his followers had succeeded in getting legislation introduced in 15 states to ban the teaching of evolution in public schools. In February, Tennessee enacted a bill introduced by State Representative John Butler, making it unlawful to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation as taught by the Bible, and to teach instead that man was descended from a lower order of animals. When the so-called Butler Act became law, the American Civil Liberties Union was itching for a fight. The ACLU published an ad in a Chattanooga newspaper, offering its services to anyone willing to challenge the new statute. George Rapelier, a coal company manager and a town booster, saw the ACLU's ad and brought a copy of it to Fred Robinson's drugstore in Dayton. Rapelier had nothing but contempt for the new law. But that was not the point he argued to other town leaders at the drugstore. A trial over the new evolution law, he argued, could put Dayton on the map, maybe even ignite a new economic boom in a town whose population had fallen from 3,000 to just 1,800. Listening to Rapelier, the others, including school superintendent Walter White, became convinced a controversial trial might just be the ticket for their ailing town. The conspirators summoned to the drugstore John Scopes, a 24-year-old general science teacher and a part-time football coach. Could Scopes be their man to test the Butler Act? Scopes later described how Rapelier put the question to him. "John, we've been arguing, and I said nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution." Scopes agreed. Rapelier pulled a copy of George William Hunter's Civic Biology, the state-approved textbook, down from one of the shelves. The drugstore sold more than drugs. It also sold school textbooks. "You've been teaching them this book?" Rapelier asked. Scopes said that while filling in for the regular biology teacher during an illness, he had assigned readings on evolution from Hunter's textbook. "Then you've been violating the law," Rapelier said. Would you be willing to stand for a test case? Scopes said he'd be happy to. As he put it years later, quote, "The best time to scotch the snake is when it starts to wiggle." Two attorneys, local, both friends of John Scopes, agreed to prosecute. The stage was almost set. Now, this version of events differs dramatically from the version presented in Inherit the Wind. The play and movie were based loosely on the actual case, very loosely. No townspeople burned Scopes in effigy. He was never hauled off to jail. William Jennings Bryan offered to join the prosecution team, despite not having practiced law in over 30 years. And when Bryan jumped in, Clarence Darrow volunteered to sign on for the defense. He relished the chance to battle the man he described as the idol of all Mormondom. But Darrow is not the first choice of the ACLU. ACLU leaders were concerned that Darrow's zealous agnosticism might turn the trial into a broadside attack on religion. So the ACLU dispatched to Dayton Arthur Garfield Hayes, a prominent free speech advocate. The final member of the defense team was Dudley Malone, an international divorce attorney. Joining the prosecution team in Dayton were present and former attorneys general for Eastern Tennessee, A.T. Stewart and Ben McKenzie. Today, Darrow and Bryan are remembered as the key adversaries in the trial, but the truth was that Hayes for the defense and Stewart for the prosecution played equally important roles. A carnival atmosphere pervaded Dayton as the opening of the trial approached. Banners decorated the streets. Vendors hawked lemonade at street corner stands. Chimpanzees performed in sideshows on Main Street. Anti-Evolution League members sold copies of T.T. Martin's Hell in the High Schools. Holy rollers rolled in the surrounding hills and on riverbanks. Marcette Haldeman Julius, who was present in Dayton for the trial, wrote, "One was hard put to know whether Dayton was holding a camp meeting, a Chautauqua, a street fair, a carnival, or a belated 4th of July celebration. It was drunk on religious excitement." Nearly 1,000 people, 300 of whom were standing, jammed the Ray County Courthouse for the first day of trial. Also in attendance were announcers ready to send to listeners the first ever live radio broadcast from a trial. Judge John Ralston, a conservative Christian who craved publicity, sat at the bench. 2 police officers stood on either side of the judge, waving huge fans to keep air circulating. The judge called the court to order. Then he asked the local minister to open the proceedings with a prayer. Clarence Darrow usually picked his juries carefully. Jury selection in Darrow's cases often took days. But in Dayton, a jury of 12 men, including 10 farmers and 11 regular churchgoers, was quickly selected. Darrow cared little who the jurors were or what they believed. For Darrow and the defense, the Scopes case was all about getting a conviction and taking the case to a higher court, preferably the U.S. Supreme Court. The goal was a Supreme Court opinion declaring laws banning the teaching of evolution unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment. As for William Jennings Bryan, his ultimate goal was adding an anti-evolution amendment to the U.S. Constitution. After jury selection, the trial adjourned for the weekend. On Sunday, Bryan delivered the sermon at Dayton's Methodist Church. He used the occasion to attack the defense strategy in the Scopes case. As Bryan spoke, Judge Ralston listened attentively in his front row pew seat. On the first business day of the trial, the defense submitted its motion to quash the indictment on constitutional grounds. The day of arguments over the law's constitutionality ended with a speech that is classic Darrow. If today you can take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in the public schools, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools. And the next year you can make it a crime to teach it to the hustings or in the church. In the next session, you may ban books and newspapers. Today it is the public school teachers, tomorrow the private. The next, the preachers and the lectures, the magazines, the books and the newspapers. After a while, Your Honor, it is the setting of man against man and creed against creed until with flying banners and beating drums, we are marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century when bigots lighted faggots to burn men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. Journalist H.L. Mencken wrote the next day about Darrow's speech. He reported, during the whole time of its delivery, the old mountebank, Bryan, sat tight-lipped and unmoved. There is, of course, no reason why it should have shaken him. He has these hillbillies locked up in his pen, and he knows it. His brand is on them. His nonsense is their ideal of sense. When he deluges them with his theologic bills, they rejoice like pilgrims disporting in the River Jordan. No one can say Mencken didn't say what he thought. Judge Ralston announced on day 4 of the trial that he would reject the defense motion to quash the indictment. It was time for opening statements. Prosecution and defense attorneys described the trial as a titanic struggle between good and evil, between truth and ignorance. Bryan argued, if evolution wins, Christianity goes. Darrow told jurors, Scopes isn't on trial, civilization is on trial. He blamed Bryan himself. He said he was responsible for the foolish, mischievous, and wicked act. Spectators gasped at Darrow's insult. The press, mostly sympathetic to the defense, ate it all up. The prosecution needed only to prove 2 things to win a conviction. First, that Scopes had actually taught the theory of evolution in school. And second, that the theory he taught contradicted the story of creation as told in Genesis. Superintendent White led off the prosecution's list of witnesses. White testified that John Scopes in Robinson's drugstore had admitted teaching evolution. Darrow, with no reason to dispute the assertion, did not cross-examine. Chief Prosecutor Tom Stewart then asked 2 students questions about what Scopes had said in class. Typical of the testimony is this exchange with freshman Howard Morgan. Stewart, just state in your own words, Howard, what he taught you. Morgan, he said that the earth was once a hot molten mass, too hot for plant or animal life to exist upon it. In the sea, the earth cooled off. There was a little germ of one-cell organism formed, and this organism kept evolving until it got to be a pretty good-sized animal. And then came on to be a land animal, and it kept on evolving. And from this was man. Darrow cross-examined, gently, though with obvious sarcasm. He asked the teenager, well, did he tell you anything else that was wicked? No, not that I remember, Howard answered. The final witness was drugstore owner Fred Robinson. Robinson testified that Scopes had stated at his store that any teacher in the state who was teaching hunters biology was violating the law. The prosecution rested. It was a simple case. Next, it was the defense's turn to present evidence. Darrow had brought to Dayton a team of experts to make the case for Darwin's theory. He called his first witness, Dr. Maynard Metcalf, a zoologist from Johns Hopkins University. The prosecution objected. Prosecutors argued that the testimony was irrelevant to Scopes' guilt or innocence under the statute. What does it matter what scientists think about evolution? All that matters under the statute, they argue, is that Scopes taught the theory. Before ruling on the prosecution's objection, Judge Ralston excused the jury and listened to some of Dr. Metcalf's testimony. The scientist's testimony provoked Bryan's only extended speech of the trial. He mocked Metcalf's exposition of the theory of evolution. Bryan complained that Metcalf's testimony had man descending not even from American monkeys, but from old world monkeys. Dudley Malone countered for the defense. In a thundering voice, Malone argued that the prosecution's position was born of the same ignorance which made it possible for theologians to bring old Galilee to trial. It was a powerful speech. There is never a duel with the truth. The truth always wins, and we are not afraid of it. The truth is no coward. The truth does not need the law. The truth does not need the force of government. The truth does not need Mr. Bryan. The truth is imperishable, eternal, and immortal, and needs no human agency to support it. We are ready to tell the truth as we understand it, and we do not fear the truth that they can present as facts. We are ready. We feel we stand with progress. We feel we stand with science. We feel we stand with intelligence. We feel we stand with fundamental freedom in America. We are not afraid. We ask your honor to admit the evidence as a matter of correct law, as a matter of sound procedure, and as a matter of justice to the defense in this case. Even anti-evolution lawmaker John Butler called it the finest speech of the century. Members of the press gave Malone a standing ovation. Most courtroom spectators joined in the sustained applause. The public's view seemed to be, let's let the two sides have at it. Ralston, however, the judge, was unmoved. The next day, the judge ruled the defense's expert testimony was inadmissible. Darrow was apoplectic. He complained, every suggestion of the prosecution should meet with an endless waste of time, and a bare suggestion of anything that is perfectly competent on our part should be immediately overruled. Judge Ralston asked Darrow, I hope you do not mean to reflect upon the court. Darrow's reply, well, Your Honor has the right to hope. I have the right to do something else, the judge responded. He found Darrow in contempt of court. The next day, however, Darrow apologized. Spectators applauded as Darrow and the judge shook hands. The contempt finding was dropped. Rumors began circulating that the courtroom floor might collapse from the weight of so many spectators. Concerned, the judge moved the proceedings to the lawn outside the courthouse. There, before a crowd that had swelled to several thousand, the defense read into the record, for purposes of appellate review, excerpts from the prepared statements of 8 scientists and 4 experts on religion who had been prepared to testify. The press widely reported the expert statements. So Darrow succeeded, after all, in his efforts to turn the trial into a national biology lesson. On the 7th day of trial, Ralston asked the defense if it had any more evidence. What followed was what the New York Times described as, quote, the most amazing court scene in Anglo-Saxon history. The defense called to the stand to testify as an expert on the Bible, prosecutor William Jennings Bryan. Now, the idea of examining Bryan did not suddenly pop into Darrow's head on the morning of July 20th, 1925. He had discussed the tactic with colleagues 2 days earlier. Darrow versus Bryan on the truth of the Bible. Now that would be a battle that would get the nation's attention. Bryan's ego knew no bounds. Darrow guessed that Bryan might find the challenge to testify irresistible, if only his co-prosecutors did not stand in his way. Darrow guessed right. Bryan dismissed the concerns of his prosecution team and took the stand willingly. His only condition was that he have the right to put Darrow and the other defense attorneys on the stand as well. Now, what was the ostensible relevance of Darrow's calling William Jennings Bryan to the stand? The argument was that the self-proclaimed biblical expert could shed light on the question of whether the Bible might be reconciled in some way with Darwin's theory. If what Scopes taught didn't contradict the Bible, the argument went, then he wasn't guilty of any crime. Now, Darrow's real purpose, of course, was to humiliate his rival. Marcette Haldeman Julius described the scene. Picture to yourself that vast throng. Before you, the branches of two great maples intertwining form a natural proscenium arch. Behind it, in the ring, the two antagonists meet. Brian, assured, pompous, his face turned to the audience, which, rather than the judge, he frankly addresses. And Darrow, standing a few feet away, his eyes on his opponent, his mind concentrated on the task before him, vigilant, relentless. Darrow hunched jacketless, wearing his trademark suspenders. He began his interrogation of Brian with a quiet question. You have given considerable study to the Bible, haven't you, Mr. Brian? Brian replied, Yes, I have. I've studied the Bible for about 50 years. And thus began a series of questions designed to undermine a literalist interpretation of the Bible. Darrow asked Brian about a whale swallowing Jonah, about Joshua making the sun stand still, about Noah and the great flood, and about the temptation of Adam in the Garden of Eden. He asked about the 7-day creation story of Genesis 1. Brian insisted, in answer after answer, everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. But then he shifted. He finally conceded that the words of the Bible should not always be taken literally. In response to Darrow's relentless questions as to whether the 6 days of creation, as described in Genesis, were 24-hour days, Brian said, My impression is that they were periods. Now, Brian had begun his testimony calmly, but as he began to stumble under Darrow's persistent questioning and prodding, at one point, the exasperated Brian said, I do not think about things I don't think about. Darrow asked cruelly, Do you think about the things you do think about? Brian responded to the laughter of spectators, Well, sometimes. Both old warriors grew testy as the examination continued. Brian accused Darrow of attempting to slur at the Bible. He said that he would continue to answer Darrow's impertinent questions because I want the world to know that this man who does not believe in God is trying to use a court in Tennessee. Darrow interrupted his witness by saying, I object to your statement and to your fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes. Well, that was enough for the judge. He ordered the court adjourned. And the next day, Ralston ruled that Brian could not return to the stand. His testimony of the previous day would be stricken. The press reported the confrontation between Brian and Darrow to be a defeat for Brian. One report described Brian as, quote, a pitiable, punch-drunk warrior. Darrow, however, deserved some criticism as well. His understanding of religion seemed not terribly sophisticated, and to some observers, he came across as an anti-religious, cynical, and a bit of a bully. The trial was nearly over. Darrow asked the jury to return a verdict of guilty. With an acquittal, he could not appeal the case. He had another reason for waiving his right to make a closing argument. By doing so, under Tennessee law, Brian was denied the opportunity to deliver his closing speech, a speech he had labored over for weeks. The jury found Scopes guilty. Judge Ralston fined him $100. John Scopes, practically a forgotten man in the trial, rose to speak for the first and only time. Your Honor, he said, I feel I have been convicted of violating an unjust statute. I will continue in the future, as I have in the past, to oppose this law in any way I can. Any other action would be a violation of my ideal of academic freedom, that is, to teach the truth as guaranteed in our Constitution of personal and religious freedom. I think the fine is unjust. The trial ended in Hollywood fashion. Brian and Darrow and the judge each made crowd-pleasing statements. Ralston concluded with this thought, I have had some difficult problems to decide in this lawsuit, and I only pray to God that I have decided them right. If I have not, the higher courts will find the mistake. But if I fail to decide them right, it was for a want of legal learning and legal attainment, and not for the want of a disposition to do everybody justice. We are glad to have had you with us." The crowd applauded. Defense attorney Arthur Garfield Hayes rose to ask a question. "May I, as one of the counsel for the defense, ask your honor to allow me to send you The Origin of the Species and the Descent of Man by Charles Darwin?" Judge Ralston laughingly accepted the offer. And that was it, except, of course, for a benediction. Bryan spent 2 days after the trial in Dayton dictating for publication his undelivered closing speech, the speech Bryan called the mountain peak of my life's effort. In the speech's last line, Bryan asked the jury what they will do with what he called the bloody, brutal doctrine of evolution. "Your answer will be heard throughout the world. It is eagerly awaited by a praying multitude. If the law is nullified, there will be rejoicing wherever God is repudiated, the Savior scoffed at, and the Bible ridiculed. Every unbeliever of every kind and degree will be happy. If, on the other hand, the law is upheld and the religion of the school children protected, millions of Christians will call you blessed, and with hearts full of gratitude to God will sing again that grand old song of triumph, faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death." 4 days later, Bryan was still in Dayton. After eating dinner, he lay down to take a nap. He never awoke. Clarence Darrow was hiking in the Smoky Mountains when word of Bryan's death reached him. When reporters suggested to him that Bryan had died of a broken heart, Darrow said, "Broken heart, nothing. He died of a busted belly." In a louder voice, he added, "His death is a great loss for the American people." A year later, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the decision of the Dayton court on a technicality, not the constitutional grounds that Darrow had hoped. According to the court, Scopes' fine should have been set by the jury, not by the judge. Rather than send the case back for further action, the court dismissed the case. It said, quote, "Nothing is to be gained by prolonging the life of this bizarre case." Both the evolutionists and the anti-evolutionists felt their own cause had been advanced in Dayton. Russell Owen, writing in the New York Times, reported, "Each side withdrew at the end of the struggle, satisfied it had unmasked the absurd pretensions of the other." Now, one way to evaluate the impact of a trial is to examine newspaper accounts of the public reaction. And by this measure, pro-evolutionists won. And they won by another measure as well. While the trial by no means ended the debate over the teaching of evolution, it was a setback for anti-evolution forces. Of the 15 states with anti-evolution legislation pending in 1925, only 2 states, Arkansas and Mississippi, enacted laws restricting the teaching of Darwin's theory. By another measure, however, the anti-evolutionists gained. The takeaway of textbook publishers was that the theory of evolution was controversial. Many publishers, after the Scopes trial, chose to present a more watered-down version of the theory than they did in earlier editions. Gone in many cases were references to humans being a product of evolution. It's just as well. The chapter on evolution Scopes assigned to his students to read ended with the startling suggestion that Caucasians are, quote, "the highest race of all." Only after the Soviet Union launched its Sputnik satellite, causing Americans to worry that they were falling behind in science education, did less compromised versions of the theory begin to reappear in textbooks. The Supreme Court did not get around to ruling on anti-evolution laws until 1968. In the case of Epperson versus Arkansas, the court held that bans on the teaching of evolution violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. In retrospect, the stick and stone throwing at fundamentalists by Darrow and Mencken during the Scopes trial was not the most mature response to the Butler Act. Caricaturing and ridiculing fundamentalists deepened regional divisions and accomplished little. Progressives could have done better. They could have devoted their energy to showing how religious communities might come to terms with the implications of the theory of evolution. Darwin's theory posed challenges for the faithful who believe our species is special and chosen by God to do special things. What society needed in 1925, and still could use more of today, are thoughtful opinion shapers who respect religious faith, even if they don't share it. People who understand the value of a story that explains our moral role in the universe.
A few takeaways for me from this trial. Well, Scopes was found guilty, but the evolutionists would win in the end. Did you notice, however, the comment about textbook publishers choosing to water down textbooks' presentation on controversial subjects? And I sympathize with their dilemma. They have to get state boards of education to buy their books. And some state boards are still very conservative, always concerned over upending long-standing traditions. But perhaps the biggest takeaway is that there always has been, is currently, and will continue to be dynamic tension between stability and change, between tradition and modernity, right back to between faith and reason. And I suggest both have a place, and that's why there will always be controversy, concern, antagonism. But I think the trick is to keep it civil, recognizing the concerns of each, to avoid the politicization and the demonizing of the other, the polarization, and instead find the common ground that is there and build upon it together. Well, comments, observations as always. Next week, the trial of the Scottsboro Boys. And as always, thank you for coming.